Good evening, everyone. This is Abhivardhan from Global Law Assembly, and here we are live for AI Now, Season 3 again. So, this is another episode for AI Now, which we are having quite quote unquote accidentally because of uh, many reasons. There have been some really interesting developments in technology as a field, and when we relate it with fields like law, policy, and sometimes even other aspects such as international relations. So, this is a quite interesting panel which I am hosting because I am going to discuss about with my fellow panelists about, although I'm a moderator, about uh, India's technological sovereignty or digital sovereignty as we know it, and what are the existent fault lines in two aspects: strategic considerations which shape a country's national interest as well as its regulatory approaches, and the governance problems. Now that spans out to ministries, that spans out to policy think tanks, that spans out to also key startups and stakeholders who play a great role in India. And we'll try to be very precise and concise. We'll try to be simple, and let's see how this discussion pans out. So I welcome Ankit Saniji. Ankit is an IP expert. He's an IP lawyer. We have Vashisht. He's a research scholar in international relations and tech, and we have Krishnan. Those who know Krishnan on Twitter, they know him. So he's a star who doesn't need an introduction. He's a very bright star. So in the Twitterati of defense economics. So welcome to all for AI Now, and I'll just throw a question right away to all three of you. We can do it in a clockwise fashion. Please take um, minimum time for your opening remarks, okay, so that we can escalate forward for more questions and more points. So my initial question to all of you is, and we'll start with Vashish then. Uh, what do you see as far as the current scenario of Indian technological sovereignty is concerned? How is it right now? How has it shaped so far? Um, how do you have an analogous quote unquote reductionist as well outlook at it, in the sense that, you know what, how has it developed per se? How do you see it? And I can ask follow up questions accordingly, and then we'll go to the next aspect regarding the discussion. We'll also take audience questions. So, viewers, please do ask questions. We will be very happy to take them. So, over to you, Vashisht. Let's begin. And it will be a clockwise manner. So, Vashisht, then Krishnan, then Ankit. Anyone can intervene with utmost respect. And yeah, let's be conversational on this. So, yeah, let's begin.
Awesome. Thank you, Abhivardhan. I really appreciate you inviting me to your podcast and for these interesting topics that we're planning to discuss today. Just for a straight off the bat, these are my insights from what I've read. I don't claim that they are the truth or that is what is happening, but just from my insights from what I've been reading and what I've been researching for my own thesis, I think if we sort of break down tech sovereignty into two large baskets, hardware and software, I think on the hardware side, uh, I I would like to say minimal sovereignty, especially as it relates to core components. Right, India does not really have a semiconductor fab system, and Arun has been talking about this on his Twitter, about India trying to get a semiconductor system going. India also does not really have any kind of control over the supply chain of raw minerals, the critical inputs. I mean, we're seeing some exports build up on the PLI, but we don't know what is the interior supply chain dependencies. So as of now, we can just assume that there is a lot, especially on the Chinese supply chain. On the software side, I think India has a bit more than on the hardware side, especially as it relates to the payments. The UPI has been absolutely revolutionary in that India is not dependent on Visa or MasterCard anymore. Should for whatever strategic purpose, India loses access to Visa or Master, like Russia did in 2014 or 15, right? On that end, India has sort of achieved full sovereignty. Um, on a couple of other aspects, though, I don't think India has, which is primarily cloud, right? And actually, the dependency is seeming to increase over time, because of I'm guessing that Amazon, AWS, Azure, and G Cloud provide such amazing services, such fast product, that either the Indian firms have not been able to match, or even if they can match in theory, they don't have the scale to do it, and there's no government sort of deliberate push to create the scale. So on cloud, on some other aspects, India has, I would say, sort of a modicum, like a moderate sovereignty. So India created NAVIC. So in case, and I'm only always thinking from an international relations perspective. I'm not a law scholar or a regulatory scholar. So for me, it's about nation state interaction, and that's my version of sovereignty. And so on that side, India has NAVIC, which, so if ever there was a case where India loses access to locational services, depending on how the NAVIC project pans out, that is another sort of aspect for sovereignty. And we can discuss other variables as we go along in the chat. So I don't want to take up too much time.
Great. Christian, you can go ahead in case, yeah.
Thanks, Avi. So I'd like to pick up where Vashishta has left. So, yeah, and the framing is absolutely right. If we are going to split the entire technology sovereignty, hardware versus software is a really good way to really analyze things. On the hardware side of things, as Vashishta said, like we are indeed much behind in terms of the technological sovereignty. And as Vashishta used the word supply chain, and I would like to phrase that a little bit differently, not contrary to what he said, but put it in a more larger contrast, more larger context. Like I would call it value chain rather than just supply chain, because uh, when we say supply chain, I think we talk from the raw material, and then the initial subcomponent manufacturing, and then the final manufacturing and assembly, and the final product, right? But apart from that, there is a value associated with the conception of the product itself, right? The R&D that goes into it, the kind of talent that goes into it, even they form part of the overall value chain of the product. And that's where we kind of are even more, that kind of adds to the differential between where we are and where we want to be in terms of hardware sovereignty. Anything like, even if let's say we want to become a manufacturing behemoth in the next 5 to 10 years, and the whole set of manufacturing equipment that we need, like there is a very funny question that goes around in policy circles, like who makes the machines that make these machines, right? So that's the question that we need to ask. Like we can start producing electronics, we can start producing digital products, and we can, but how are we going to make it? Like these machines are still going to come from abroad. We would still be dependent on Germany or Japan or other countries for service. And uh, so that's the primary issue that we need to tackle at a very fundamental level. I think our current public discourse, I can't speak for the government, what goes on within the government, but at least the current public discourse, it is still at a very superficial level when it comes to the understanding of how to go about becoming a technological superpower. We are still talking in terms of products and processes rather than talking in terms of capabilities and innovation capabilities. So only when we go to that paradigm would we be able to make a better would we be able to appreciate better as to what lies ahead and what is in front of us right now. And we would also have the ability to kind of reshape the way we want to take our journey, as well as how we want the international community to react to us based on our interests. So if we are still going to continue to talk in terms of products and processes, we are still letting those who are ahead of us currently define our outcomes and define our processes. So that's something that we need to look at. And in the software realm, I think, yeah, we have quite a bit of a natural advantage. That's mainly because we just occupy the entire base of the software industry, even though we may not necessarily be in the upper echelons of the technology regime. But at some point of time, we need to not just focus on spreading across fully horizontally, and we also need to start moving up in terms of value chain, and kind of create carve ourselves a unique path to the top of the ladder. So not quantity by itself gives us a certain degree of sovereignty in the software domain, but quality is something that we need to focus on also in the coming months and years. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So yeah, Aniket ji, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Vashisht Krishnan, for that wonderful sort of description of the lay of the land, especially from your respective perspectives. Again, as Abhivadan introduced me, I'm basically a man of law, not a man of technology. So I'd like to perhaps offer some perspectives from a regulatory and legal perspective. You see, what I believe is for India to really achieve what it aspires to be, to move ahead in the direction of greater technological sovereignty, I think the first junction that we will face, or we are facing this stage, is to realize that technology is got a very vast meaning in today's age. On one hand, there is the ongoing pandemic, which has given rise to research and development, and immense kind of focus on healthcare, health services, and even in terms of manufacturing medical devices and so on, and of course vaccines and everything else. So that's one kind of technology which the world has been talking about and has been particularly focusing on since the past 2 years at least. Then, of course, there are a vast number of industries that this pertains to. It pertains to, as you mentioned, the semiconductor industry, as understood in the classic context. It pertains to defense, with what has happened in the past 72 hours. A lot of countries may be wanting to go back to the drawing board to reassess what their defense acquisition or research and development or partnership strategy should be, given the apparently changed dynamics or relationships that have emerged or are likely to emerge after the end of this crisis. In that context, I think that the first junction to cross for us is to take a call on whether we'd like to, as a country, as a government, as a country, as a sovereign, approach it in a sector by sector manner, because that could be one way of doing it, because the concerns or your natural partners when it comes to pharmaceuticals and healthcare would differ from what your natural partners would be for defense technology, let's say. So that's the first question that we need to answer. I'm not a policy expert, specifically not an expert on defense or pharma policy or anything of that sort. But as a consumer of knowledge and a consumer of information, I haven't come across much insights or many perspectives around whether India's, or for that matter, any other country in the region has approached this problem in this manner at all, or thought about how we should have, say, specialized teams of experts from across different competencies that all focus on a particular sector, come together and build that sector's tech policy, and lay out the path for tech sovereignty or tech growth or whatever we aspire to do. Moving on, I think what we must also focus on two important aspects that need to be highlighted. Data appears to be the new oil, at least for the foreseeable future, and definitely is going to increase in value. Therefore, the question of how data is to be governed, how it is to be monetized, stored, etc., will also play a big role. And there are two things that come to one's minds when we talk about data. One is, of course, the fact that we are the world's largest democracy. We are the second most populous country on the path to becoming the most populous one. That obviously gives us a significant edge in terms of human capital, naturally. And we can be, as I was discussing with Abhivardhan earlier during the day, we do basically come across or are seen to different businesses across the world as the largest sandbox for them to come experiment and play. Now, in the absence of a definite data protection law, and I do understand this has been emphasized so many times over across so many different forums, and debates and so on. But I think we really need to emphasize this further: the need to have an effective, robust data protection legal regime in place at the earliest. Because if we don't have that, and we're basically a country that has never had this kind of law before, what we have or we've had since 2011 is basically just ticking the boxes and having something for the sake of having something. But it definitely cannot be said to be a comprehensive data protection legislation by any stretch of imagination. So that's, in my view, that's the first priority, because when we decide how to govern the data belonging to our companies, our citizens, that is eventually how we're going to be able to monetize out of it and move in one direction or the other, or to prevent other countries or companies based in other countries, etc., from misusing the data that belongs to India or Indians to their advantage. That is one outcome of this. The other outcome is, of course, the fact that we can also, depending on how we eventually frame our data protection laws and our cloud policies and so on and so forth, we could, with the infrastructure and again the human capital that we have, strive to become the world's data center for storage and processing of data, and that could be a different dimension altogether. So this is in terms of data. The other issue is, of course, with the emerging importance of artificial intelligence and machine learning. India, especially in the context of innovation and intellectual property laws and regulations, still doesn't have an outlook or a position on how we're going to treat this. Again, as Abhi and I were talking earlier, I was telling him how I was really amazed by this app, this taxi company that is owned by Google, and they're currently piloting in a few cities in the US. I remember Denver being one of those cities, I think, and I fail to recall with certainty, but I think the name of the application, the company is called Waymo. So they're basically doing driverless taxis. So you see how this entire ecosystem of driverless taxis, this is just one use case or one instance of the application of artificial intelligence in the contemporary era. This is something that is happening with us now. This isn't futuristic. We aren't talking in Star Trek terms. This is stuff that has already hit the markets. It's on your phone, and if you're living in the relevant parts of the world, you can step out and order a Waymo taxi, which is a replacement to your regular Uber or Lyft or whatever. So the thing is, the ecosystem in which companies like these are functioning, they're generating huge amounts of data. For instance, the Waymo app, the Waymo cab, each Waymo cab taxi has some 12 or 14 sensors around it. And as it runs through the city, there is crucial data that it collects, both pertaining to traffic, to obstacles, accidents, how many people cross the zebra crossing at a particular juncture, and so on and so forth. Very crucial information, and all of this information or data is actually being generated autonomously by artificial intelligence in a certain sense. Although there's definitely no human being involved because it's just a taxi and its sensors. So till we have, so coming back to the whole point, till we have a tangible, robust policy or outlook on how we're going to govern this data, how are we going to decide questions of ownership, and consequently, how are we going to allow right holders to enforce their rights and monetize this data? I think the idea of being very tech sovereign or independent remains distant. And this I'm saying particularly with my personal experience of launching test cases for AI created paintings and getting into the debate of nudging governments across the world into debates of what should be the treatment meted out to a painting that has been co-authored by a human being and an AI-based program. So India, unfortunately, is much behind the curve at the moment because most of the other major economies of the world have either already launched a consultation or several consultations or are in the process of finalizing draft legislations and bringing about policy and thus legislative clarity on these points. So I think I'll pause here, but these are my thoughts to kick off this conversation, and I look forward to engaging with all of you on this further. Thank you.
Certainly my pleasure, and I think also for the panelists. Before we go ahead, I have some points to make, and then the question on that context. But Vashish and Krishnan, would you like to say something, add something? Yeah.
I was just listening and learning, so they were all very valid points, especially from the legal perspective. I do believe to an extent, though, that regulation is not going to solve the issue of bringing about sovereignty. I think it will have to be as sort of Krishnan mentioned, a industrial policy focus. Regulation can sort of nudge along the marginal lines, but regulation can and always will be evaded to an extent. Whereas industrial policy will focus on the actors rather than the regulation, right? And the actors being firms. Firms are the ones that do the monetization, that do the processing of data, and all of these things you said. And I think this is where, if we're now seeing even in Europe, right? So I'll just take cloud as an example because there's such high degree of market concentration in cloud services that everyone is scared that, tomorrow a country can wake up and lose access to AWS like a switch. The secondary sanctions work very well. And in fact, these would be primary sanctions because these are American firms. So, Europe sort of is aware of this, and they came up with the Gaia X program, right? This is not just a regulatory approach, but this is directly intervening in markets to tilt the markets in the favor of domestic enterprises or domestic firms. And I think that's kind of where India has to start thinking about is, at least in my opinion, is if you are to achieve some modicum of tech sovereignty, it will, of course, have to involve regulatory, but it will need to be intervening in markets, actually bring in inefficiency, because efficiency leads to market concentration. There's a very direct link that efficiency leads to market concentration, especially in the tech world. And market concentration leads to non-Indian firms because the non-Indian firms are already the dominant ones. So actually bringing in inefficiency, bringing in resiliency, increasing the costs marginally to tilt the balance in favor of Indian firms would sort of be the approach to take. Now, when I say tech sovereignty, there's no 100% sovereignty in a globalized world. What you want, ideally, the way to think about this is, can you prevent the most arduous things that can happen to your country. So can you prevent yeah, can you prevent Swift? That's the kind of thinking that has to go behind, which is, can you prevent a catastrophic event happening overnight in the economic sense? And countries have taken different approaches, right? So, for example, East Asian countries have said, we're never going to become fully sovereign in all fields. What we're going to do is we're going to become so dominant in niche but very important sectors of the global economy that if anybody sort of decides to weaponize on us, the entire global economy can come crashing down, right? I mean, if for whatever bizarre reason tomorrow things are weaponized on Taiwan can actually bring the entire global economy down. I mean, it's going to hurt them, but they can, if they wanted to put that pain, right? Same thing with South Korea, with Japan. So India has to figure out, it's not going to create tech sovereignty in sort of every issue area. Dependencies will have to be there because we live in a globalized world. But what are some of the things that can be done through industrial policy, through regulation, in important variables where there is high levels of market concentration of non-Indian firms, and sort of try to evade that, and then figure out what are some of the niche sectors of the tech economy, whether on the hardware or the software side, where they can create national champions, which then become global champions, which then gives this kind of niche protection, right? Against future weaponization. So that's like my 2 cents.
Yep. No, I don't have much to add, but I just maybe I'm gonna largely paraphrase what Vashishta was telling, but yeah, I mean, to when we really start talking about regulatory frameworks in this technology domain, um, I think I'm not sure where the government is in this part, but I did see a lot of international consultations and working on data protection and cybersecurity at an international level. Um, I am not sure whether that's the right path to go. I believe we need to first frame regulations and policies from a national interest point of view. So, which means that uh, it is easy for a country like India that is so much into the information technology. It is easy for a lot of Western nations to kind of try to bring us to the table, but still them being the dominant decider of policies from an international framework point of view. And that is something that may not be completely in our national interest in the long term. So before we jump on to kind of participating in an international regulatory framework, I believe we need to focus on uh, defining what our national interest is. Like, let us say, on a scale of China to a scale of another Western country that has very less technological sovereignty. Uh, we have to choose between where we want to be uh, in terms of how much do we want to have sovereignty for ourselves and how much are we going to benefit more by participating in the global commons. So in that perspective, I think we need to define our objectives and also work towards developing our capabilities while creating an internal regulatory framework before we go to the global economy and then start negotiating for a common regulatory framework for our technology.
Yeah, actually, that was really good that Krishnan brought it up. It's 3:30 in the morning, so I'm blanking on that. But um, it absolutely, before India signs a dotted line on any of these new digital and tech sort of FTAs or things like that, it needs to understand what are the sort of dependencies that these FTAs or these protocols that it's planning to sign on to, or it may have to sign on to, the dependencies that it will create, because a lot of the digital agreements will mandate free flow of data, will effectively nullify a significant chunk of industrial policymaking, or make it liable to arbitration. So before that happens, or before India makes a mistake, like what happened with the Southeast Asian nations, India created an FTA, and manufacturing actually suffered, right? So I don't. So like basically what Christian said, before India gets into any global agreements, especially on the tech end, it needs to understand where are its interests, what things can it sovereignize, what can it not, and in which niche aspects of the digital economy can it basically monopolize. And by monopolizing a particular sector, it prevents itself from weaponization, because then it has a deterrent.
Uh, Ankit ji, would you like to add something? Yeah.
No, I think I completely agree with both Krishnan and Vashish that regulation is not necessarily the best way forward. And we kind of also have to determine uh, what how much of the scales are to be tipped in what basically the scales are to be tipped in what direction, to what extent. Sovereignty versus participation in globalism and globalization. So, to what extent should we regulate everything and promote protectionism, versus to what extent do we open up our markets and allow others to come and participate? And I also agree, before harmonization, any exercises around harmonization of regulations or policies, we must focus on framing our own domestic policy. Once that's done, that's the next step is, of course, looking at um, uh, talking to other countries on what can be done on getting together and making this or putting this at a larger scale. So yes, those are my thoughts. And back to you, Abhivardhan, for the next question or the next topic.
Great. So let's discuss industrial policy and let's discuss the way we look at technologies. I had authored a report for GLA, Global Law Assembly, on artificial intelligence ethics modalities in the Indo-Pacific. And my co-authors and I had proposed that India is at the heart of in the Indo-Pacific here because big country demographics, blah blah blah. These are very obvious reasons, but it's about also the challenges of how we deal with tech transfer, how we deal with R&D, how we correlate it with our IP approaches. Because let's be clear, it's not just about a national IP policy by the government of India. I think it wasn't. I think Ankit ji can correct me. It is 2017 or 2019 when the national IP policy came in, and uh, uh, it's not just limited to that problem, an aspect, right? So, um, I think what genuinely happens, and we have tried to analyze that in the report, is that when India tries to cooperate and develop its Indo-Pacific policy. So let's take the best example. If you read the recent statements by the Quad, especially the Quad principles on technology design, I think they came in December or November 2021, and they were the principles of technology design. They are very similar to how the EU also look at the design and default concept of any system, particularly. Even in AI, we saw the same trend. That is how it is seen. Now, if you compare the national AI strategies also, uh, I'll jump to the Niti Aayog's 2018 national strategy and the AI ethics operationalizing document in August 2021 or September 2021, if I'm right. The part where Niti Aayog agrees that most AI ethics conceptions are West oriented or West based is something which is very applauding. But the sad part is that it's very scattered as far as its approach is concerned. Maybe it is that they are not looking at the way startups are growing in India. They are not looking at the way R&D and AI and such technologies is necessary. And merely coming up with policies and strategies is not the way. Sometimes you have to direct and make it clear as to how you wish to go ahead. And this is where I find the cracks, because stakeholder engagement is very normal. Foreign and domestic companies engage with policy think tanks and government ministries around the world. This is not new with Niti Aayog. It's not the planning commission. Its own approach is very different. And we very apparently see that with regulation, the social media rules also, for example, they are not going to just triumph and work very well. It depends on its value, not just because there are sadly untenable questions on constitutionality which are raised, but only simply because the way the guidelines are understood and made to predict legislative intent, or not just predict, basically make it clear what's the legislative intent. Otherwise you can't just predict legislative intent. That's something which does not it's like it has lacuna a lot. So yeah, I think it reeks of the deeper hollowness in certain ways. I see that. And despite the fact that we have startups, we have innovative people, and we are trying to do so, we are not able to go beyond the cocoon of you know too many stakeholders advising us, and really going to the next level in that regard. So I think Vashisht and Krishnan are also correct. Vashisht are absolutely right. Like the Quad, for example. The Quad is an issue-based coalition, so it has certain cooperation in certain areas. It can't do in every area. And I think as India has to grow accordingly, it has to see which niche works for it, or it can go for I don't know, a calibrated combination of various things. But we still have to see forth. So my question, very straightforward to all of you, is this: what are the fault lines which actually have emerged for now? Do you see in the sense when it comes to India's lack of having an industrial, I would say, policy ethic and not a policy? Because when I say policy, I don't mean coming up with a PDF on something and merely publishing it and having a webinar. I don't mean that. I directly mean, with all due respect to government agencies and the Niti Aayog, implementation strategy, plan of action. Because plan of action has already come in various Asian countries and even in Oceania.
Do you
Yeah, I
want me
think
to
it's
go?
audible now.
I think Ankit, you might be better to start off this one before I
Yeah,
formulate my thoughts.
yeah, sure. I think
Sure, Sean. Happy
yeah,
to. Sure. No, happy to jump in. I think in terms of fault lines, I mean, I will speak more from the perspective of my experience of having graduated from law school 10 years, more than 10 years ago. What regime was in place then, and how we used to engage with various stakeholders, the government side, on behalf of clients, mostly large multinational corporations or large Indian companies, versus post 2014 when the present administration came in. And I'm saying this apolitically, and I hope it gets conveyed in the same fashion. I There has been a drastic difference in how the people who walk the corridors of Udyog Bhavan uh, in the North Block and so on and so forth, how responsive they've been, because what we have to bear in mind is the people are still the same. India largely follows a service based bureaucracy where people, once they enter the system, it's a permanent job and they remain in the system for as long as they're allowed, and then they retire from it. Versus the approach that a large number of countries, especially Western countries, but a lot of Eastern countries as well follow, which is getting people as direct recruits from the industry. Now, regardless, because of able leadership, as they say, there's this age-old idiom that says, the guys at the top, they determine the flavor, the flavor of the season. So you see, depending on what kind of, again, is intended to be absolutely apolitical. Therefore, I will try to present it in that fashion to whatever extent I can. But with the new set of leadership that came in 2014, and even till date, what I personally saw as a lawyer and as a representative of various companies when we go to make representations or do advocacy around issues, changes that are required in policy or law, is that there is there's a very customer centric approach, if I could put it that way, that has come in, which is a very good thing. Before 2014, you would write mails and mails and letters and letters, and none of them were really answered. That was the general trend and general question. Post 2014, the government has been really, or the bureaucracy has been really welcoming in terms of engaging with stakeholders, understanding issues, and so on. But what happens is that the aftertaste or the hangover of the bureaucratic system that we have in the country unfortunately remains, although the government has brought in as an exception just to test, because then it became a sensitive issue with people who had prepared for and written the IAS exams and got recruited and have been as permanent employees in the system, for outsiders to be brought in from a consultancy or from a company who were in their erstwhile roles, CEOs or CFOs, etc., to be brought in directly as joint secretary and so on. It was a sensitive issue, but they did it successfully with some names that I would not like to take on this forum, but some people who I personally have a lot of respect for. You see, all of this has been positive. Now, the fault lines, in my view, have been largely because some places the government has done well with policies and implementation, as Abhivardhan puts it. Consider, for instance, the PLI scheme, performance-linked incentive scheme pertaining to manufacturing of mobile phones, for instance. Now, electric vehicles, for instance. We've seen a record number of companies step out of Taiwan, step out of China. See, if it was only China, like the opposition, the present opposition, the party in opposition said, is China, it's because of the pandemic or other geopolitical reasons, the companies have decided to come out. India is the next best alternative to China, so that's how you're gaining. But when I saw companies step out of Taiwan, step out of other regional manufacturing hubs and come to India, I thought we're really doing something well in terms of convincing people that, well, this is our policy. It exists on paper in PDF form, but this is how we are implementing this, or we plan to implement this. So to attract and convince very large companies, leaders in certain, I'm talking about Qualcomm and Foxconn and these kind of companies that have shifted base to India, and more companies continue to follow. I think those are things that have proven that the present administration has done well to mend the gaps that existed. But of course, there are a number of other areas where these fault lines exist, and there are policies that are announced and basically nothing happens. So I think what needs to be seen is it's more the issue of what ministry we're talking about, unfortunately, because that also plays a factor. For instance, when we interact with people from Ministry of Electronics or Ministry of Information and Broadcasting or Ministry of Commerce, DPIIT. Now, this is the creme de la creme in my experience of dealing with Indian bureaucrats. These are people who are super smart or have been deliberately, for a reason, been brought in from different ministries, departments, owing to their expertise. Because the system that India largely followed before this was, Okay, just be a generalist, graduate in geography, then spend some years in Ministry of Textiles as director, and then spend some more years being the district magistrate, handling the revenue affairs of a district, then be transferred to Khadi Village Industries Commission, and so on. That's which is really, in my view, for the lack of a better or more diplomatic word, it's absolutely stupid and it doesn't make sense. So this has been adding to the woes, because of course corruption is a large part of the problem as well. But the other part is incompetence, because when you see people who have graduated in geography, for instance, handling issues of commerce or data or intermediaries and social media, there is obviously going to be a major disconnect between industry, their issues, and how effectively they are understood by the guys in charge, right? And as we understand, in a large democracy and setup like India, the ministers really have just the final word on what happens. Much of the working parts, the moving parts, the manner in which they're put together, and what shape the document takes is really done by the guys that are additional secretary or often joint secretary and below. So this has been one reason. But like Abhivardhan said, for instance, industries that mattered, what the present administration perhaps learned over time to mend these faults, the ones that I'm referring to, of course, there are different experiences that each of us may have had, and I would love to hear Vashish's or Krishnan's experiences in terms of what in their perception are the faults. But from my perception, from my perspective as a regulatory or legal person, these are the things that are most often faced. Now, over the years, what they learned was that we need more and more public-private participation. So a lot of these bodies, like for instance, India AI, or for instance, CPAM in IP, or other bodies, they emerged, which basically became either independent departments or bodies under the aegis of the larger ministry, but independent in the sense they were headed by a CEO or somebody who was from the bureaucracy but had ample amount of participation from the private sector, and then collaboratively they contributed to various discussions, debates, etc., that finally culminated in how the policy should be. I'll give you an example. I think this is again just my personal view on this, but since Abhivardhan mentioned the social media or the OTT sector, the OTT industry, I think what emerged as a debate out of the debate at that point in time around censorship, from where it started basically, and from where it always starts as far as broadcasting or content is concerned in India is concerned. Bureaucrats have this long lost attachment with censorship, because it gives you a very a power kind of feeling. So it started off from there, but because of the way things had improvised in the channels or the methods of engaging with industry that the government had focused on creating in the past 5, 6, 7 years, what resulted, the 2021 intermediary guidelines, are much better than what it could have ended up in. For instance, had the industry not been given an opportunity to be ably heard either before the parliamentary standing committee or before the minister or the joint secretary and so on and so forth. So self-regulation, for instance, when you speak to somebody who's from the content or OTT or broadcasting industry, would tell you that self-regulation is a much better approach than censorship. That's a no-brainer, right? And they could achieve that. Now, this could be achieved effectively only because the present administration over the past 5, 6, 7 years worked on opening up these channels and improvising how an open policy dialogue could be undertaken between private stakeholders and the government. So these are my views on what the fault lines are and how things have improved. And with this, I think in the interest of time, I'll just take a pause and pass it on to Vashisht or Krishnan, whoever would like to intervene at this stage.
Just one thing to add before Vashisht and Krishnan go ahead. Just one thing out of interest. So, uh, we're talking about various institutions which Ankitji talked about. I think there is no doubt that India is one of the most interesting countries to have a much quote unquote democratized multi stakeholderist approach. In fact, the Niti Aayog, in its operationalizing document on AI ethics, which is particularly on responsible AI, mentioned the word multi stakeholder. So I'll be honest, there is some multi stakeholder engagement, but how that translates, I think that's somewhere the focus is. And this discussion is to educate people about this aspect because I'm not saying that the governments are not doing. I think, yes, there are some people who are doing, but yes, people will say there are two sides to the same coin. I'll just say it is as it is. So I'll just pause there because I intervened abruptly, but I'll ask Krishnan to go at first and then Vashisht. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just answer to the first point that you raised last, which is the multi-stakeholdership that you mentioned. So that's one of the bigger problems with our long-standing bureaucracy and the leadership, right? Like we see a certain degree of lack of leadership when we really talk about these kind of things. I mean, I'm not really talking about the political leadership, but I'm talking about the bureaucracy as a whole. That when there is a scenario like I just like to take you through like a typical scenario when the government of India decides to get into policy framing in a new area in which it has very little experience. So I believe it brings in a whole bunch of experts from across the spectrum, legal experts, technological experts, like technocrats who come into the picture. The problem is it is not able to take ownership while driving the policy making framework. So what happens is that when it starts with multi stakeholdership, even the decision making or like framing of the objectives itself, when that becomes multi stakeholder, like multiple people coming in and pitching their ideas, I think we really do not come down to a really coherent strategy or a coherent objective in the first place. I think Ankit has had a really personal experience when it comes to the government, and I would definitely hearing those are really good. I mean, like heartwarming for me in terms of how the government has transformed in certain areas. But I would still think that leadership and ownership must primarily rest with the government, and it should be demonstrative in terms of its actions and intent rather than mere words. So when it comes to that, the either at the policy making level or at the policy implementation level, uh, I mean, we've been a more than 70-year-old democracy, and we've been like almost more than 30 years of a liberal economy, globalized economy. But let's be really frank, we are still a long way from becoming a nation or an economy where once we point a direction, we are going to have the animal spirits of the economy automatically revving up its engine, doing whatever is necessary, and getting things done. There is still the necessity of the visible hand of the government um, that has to play the jump starter role, or how do I put it in mechanical terms, as yeah, jump starter plus a turbocharger role. It has to perform both. So which means that it is not enough that the government comes, or the government's in thinking, like the think tank, which is Niti Aayog, comes with a coherent policy structure, and then it sits back and watches as to what happens, because nothing is going to happen. The sad truth is, like, the market or the end objectives is not apparent for the key players who we would want to see enter and succeed to kind of actualize those policy. So there is a need for the government itself to pump in money. Money is the biggest signaler of stakeholdership, and also an intent to, it's the oil that drives the engine, right? So you would as a government, it is very easy to sit inside a room. I'm sorry, not as a government, as a government think tank, it is really easy for people to sit inside a room, theorize, bring in the right policy experts, no doubt, but theorize, but still not able to see the practical difficulties, because the terrain itself is very different from where previously those theories might have succeeded. So it is really important that people judge the terrain in which the policy making is happening, and also try to bring in the necessary firepower to push forward the policy and implement the policy into actual actual points. So when you previously spoke about the government, Niti Aayog, or any other like a multi ministry mission, or a multi-ministry task force that comes up with task actionable points, I think even then we have not done our job. We would have to still go beyond that, set up a mission office, provide it with ample funding, provide it with the necessary legal protection for it to be able to go out, and also with the necessary financial backing for the policy to be actually considered to be a fully implementable policy. Otherwise, we are really, there is no difference between a government think tank and a private think tank. A private think tank can do the same stuff, bring in the right experts, write policy briefs, and it can sit and it can say that it has performed everything to its satisfaction. But the main difference is, what is the government bringing to the table to kind of actualize the policy that it itself creates? And that is a question that I think it partially has to do with the socialist mindset of our policymakers. Like, we think that people on payrolls, if they are given a direction, they are going to get the job done. That's not how things work. A lot of capital, a lot of resources are needed to kind of actualize those policies into results. And those are not going to come from the private sector, because the private sector is it's on its own dime at this point of time. And the government by itself, most of the times it goes on an no cost, no commitment basis for a lot of projects. And that is not really the framework with which new private sector players are going to enter. So it is nice that the private sector is invited as a stakeholder in all this policy making. But if one thinks that giving them the ability to frame policies is going to make them invest and do the government's job, that's not going to happen. I'm really sorry about it. The government has to take leadership both in terms of policy making, also become the one of the primary stakeholders in terms of implementation, and then slowly step off the gear and leave it to the private players. Yeah, that's about it.
So I took down a couple notes. We discussed a few points, and I just wanted to have a few sort of thoughts on that. The first, I know you started off with the Quad and cooperation with the Quad. So I think one of the best sort of articles that I've come across on Quad, especially economic cooperation, was Pranay Kotasthane wrote a paper for ISIS, which is based out of NUS, in 26 April 2021. It's called Silicon Politic, the Case for a Quad Semiconductor Partnership. And I think that article really lays down what India can do in the semiconductor and especially economic cooperation within the Quad. Now, there are aspects like the semiconductor chain, value chain, supply chain, whatever you want to call it, where India cannot go alone. It's just not possible. sovereignty has to be mixed with reality, and reality is that India just can't do everything by itself. No country can. Even the United States cannot. Um, so there is going to be dependencies, and it's okay as long as you negotiate codependencies, right? And I think what Pranay is sort of in that article trying to get at is a case for each individual quad country to sort of specialize in a particular area of the semiconductors supply chain, value chain, such that they protect themselves from each other's sort of bad intentions, but they also protect the quad itself from foreign supply chain, value chain disruptions, economic sanctions, whatever they may be, right? So I think that's kind of how you can look around globalization: is what niche expertise are you going to build, and how you're going to sort of get the world dependent on that niche expertise. And by bringing that niche expertise, you're going to sort of protect the other dependencies that you have created, because you have one chokehold, right? Or one or two or three, and I'm just making an example here. The other aspect that sort of we talked about is, Indian government policy making. um, First, we brought up multi-stakeholder. I am understand what multi-stakeholder means, and a lot of the times in tech policy, that turns into a conversation with foreign companies, right? And foreign companies I'm not saying they're bad. I'm saying they have a distinct interest because they are not Indian. They have a distinct interest and they have a distinct viewpoint of how the world should function. Foreign governments have a distinct viewpoint and a distinct interest on how India should create its tech sector or regulation in a particular interest area. What India needs to have is a sort of a conversation with national companies and separately, and then open up the conversation to foreign companies, because foreign companies will always sort of push for things that will help their business. This is the job of a corporation. You can't fault them for that. But by helping their business, it effectively, because they're foreign, it creates India's dependencies on those foreign companies. So the conversation that, in my opinion, that needs to be had is it needs to be a very sort of East Asian economic nationalist type conversation, where the government is an activist, it builds out the national champions, and then once those national champions, you have the conversation, you design a policy for the national champions, then of course you take inputs from foreign companies to make the markets work better. But if you take just an input from a foreign corporation, it actually defeats the purpose of creating sovereignty. African countries are the prime example on pharma, right? Everyone is like, oh, you want to sign a trade deal, you have to have Western style IP laws. Well, Western style IP laws basically means you can't copycat Pfizer's next drug, right? Or you cannot copy a life-saving medicine that's somehow being manipulated by giving extensions on their IP rights in the US, because you're now doing automatic IP from US to your country, IP protection, right? So you also don't want to do that. Every Western law is probably not the best for a developing country. Developing countries need to have certain stances that are in contrast to Western regulatory institutions, because they're a developing country. They're not developed. You cannot protect IP in pharma in India the way IP is protected in the US, because in the US you can buy a $2,000 cancer drug. In India, nobody can buy a $2,000 a pill cancer drug. It has to be re-engineered and sold at 100 rupees or 50 rupees or whatever it is, right? And so I'm not a big proponent of high-end IP protection. I think high-end IP protection again tilts the balance in favor of those companies that hold the IP, which are more likely than not Western corporations. I think the second point to India's conversation around um, multi-stakeholderism is far more than it should happen. India's regulatory institutions are in contact with their Western counterparts rather than in contact with their developing country counterparts. And this is because India speaks English. Everyone studies in the U.S. or U.K. Everyone knows U.S. or U.K. Whatever may be the familiarity reason or ease of conversation reason. But I guarantee you, if Métis had more conversations with the Chinese or the Russians, there would be a different sets of viewpoints that would emerge that may not emerge from having a conversation with the FCC or having a conversation with the Europeans or the Brits or whoever. So I think India also needs to sort of rediscover its developing country links with other developing countries and see how they're thinking around these issues, right? Because developing countries face similar issues as opposed to developed and developing countries. The reason why semiconductor has become a big issue in the US is because that's where US has dependencies. There's not a big conversation around cloud because all the firms in the world that dominate the cloud are more likely than not American firms. So why would there be a need to be having a conversation? Why would there a need to be having a conversation around global navigation satellite systems? Because GPS is ubiquitous, right? And GPS is a US entity. So the reason why semiconductor is a big conversation in the US is because it is particular to the US. It is particular to US dependencies. For developing countries, there are different dependencies. And therefore, developing countries need to start thinking around where their dependencies lie, where can they ameliorate, where can they create niche sort of put themselves within the value chain in such a way that they dominate one part of the value chain, where developing countries can start having conversations between other developing countries. And as much as we Indians have a thing against China, and I rightly agree, having conversations with the Chinese around technology, around supply chain, industrial chain, just learning from the Chinese, even if you don't have a conversation, is important. Learning from the Russians, learning from the Brazilians, right? Because countries are facing the same issues, especially developing countries. But that's my 2 cents.
And I will add on this that the way the and there's a very interesting article written by Samir Saran, president of ORF, who wrote about and I'll tell you the title. It is the big tech versus the red tech. Now the big tech, we know, the Americans most probably, and the red tech is the CCP. You know, uh, we've also seen a quite comprehensive algorithmic regulation policy by the Chinese Communist Party. I'll not say the CCP, I'll say the Ministry of Technology and Industry, whatsoever it is in the Chinese government. So I definitely vouch for this aspect that to understand our competitors in that sense, to become a regulatory superpower, we have to see where we can go ahead. Regulation can be like, I'll not say cherry on the cake, but more like a better icing with better stability, that what the icing does not fail. It's not like a third rated cake or something like that. The cream should be good, it should be tasty. So I make this analogy, but I think it's understandable for eggless or pro egg cake lovers. So I think let's go to the concluding aspect of this discussion, because we have discussed quite productively so far. And um, if we see, as the Indo Pacific emerges with time, uh, do we really have to reckon this aspect that And as I had mentioned, the article by Samir Saran, which is the big tech versus the red tech, I refer that article very, very importantly because of the quote unquote Pax Sinica and digital BRI. And that is something which is not just about infrastructure projects, but it's beyond infrastructure projects and a kind of a digital penetration which can happen. Because we have to understand that while China bans neoliberal companies like Google and Google, not YouTube, of course, they're same, Google, Facebook, now Meta, and others into China for use, and even Amazon for that matter, it's very apparent that TikTok is still being used in the US. And some countries might have banned it, like India and others, but we have to understand how this relationship happens between two neoliberal camps. I'll still say neoliberal because despite the fact that Xi Jinping is focusing on a pro manufacturing economy, clamping down on Alibaba was about basically clamping down on the neoliberal tendencies of such companies which came out of that technological boom. And with that, we can remember the 2005 WISIS, which is the World Summit on International Information Society by the International Telecommunication Union and the Tunis Agenda. So on ICTs. So the question which I have is on Pax Sinica and the way American entities somewhere down the line have that crisscross relationship, which seems complicated from not just a regulatory aspect, POV, but also from, I'd say, the way technology transfer and cooperation is to be understood. Because as I think Krishnan discussed it, or Vashish discussed it, or somebody discussed it, if Taiwan, that's which is Republic of China, is gone, somewhere down the line, the whole semiconductor reliability itself will be affected geopolitically and geoeconomically. So here's the question simply on how we look at this crisscross nexus, not say for now, I'll not say nexus, I'll say correlated trends that Pax Seneca and American entities have in, and what's the Pandora box for India to look forward. So let's start with Vashish, then Krishnan, and then Ankitji. Just brief remarks, and these are the concluding remarks I'm asking for. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, look, you cannot evade gravity. So you just cannot evade United States, China. You cannot have 100% sovereignty. That does not exist anymore. It is a fiction of our imagination. At least this is my opinion. Um, what and I'm going to beat a dead horse again. What India can do in this position is sort of maximize its middle, sort of second tier role in the world, in the best way possible. Maximize it in a way that it's not going to get to the superpower status. I hate to like sort of get there. But in that below superpower status, India cements its role and securitizes its future from any adverse economic actions that any of the superpowers can potentially take in the future. And what that means is India has to really kind of, as much as India's cooperation with the United States increases and as its cooperation with the Chinese sort of decrease, it has to think of the entire spectrum as a whole and figure out where there are ways it can create vetoes for a potential economic weaponization on itself in the future. So, for example, UPI is one, right? It's a totally domestic program, but it effectively insulates India from any potential weaponization of payment systems. Another one would be, somewhere down the line when NAVIC, again, I go back to NAVIC because it is so important. Somewhere down the line, if there is a weaponization of GPS, India has its NAVIC working test use case that its entire economy can shift onto. Things like that, where you can create vetoes to block effects onto you, and then create expertise and dominance in niche areas of critical sector supply chains where you can counter weaponize if something does happen to you. There are things that India can do to protect its sovereignty, to protect things happening onto itself, and there are things that India can do to act as a sort of deterrent, where maybe somebody can weaponize economic sanctions or whatever variable on India, but because India has that very small ubiquitous dominance in the entire supply chain, it can flip around and weaponize that, in effect sort of nullifying a potential economic weaponization onto itself. I'm not really explaining this well, but I hope people are getting what I'm saying. So I think, in my opinion, that is the only way forward, is build out your vetoes as much as you can, and in the areas or the sectors of the economy where you cannot build out the vetoes, create dominance in a subsection of the supply chain where the world cannot live without you. And that's sort of India's strategy of sovereignty. And so you will have dependencies in a significant chunk of issue areas, but you will have created blocks in place that, should any of the superpowers try to weaponize it against you, it kind of fails, or it becomes extremely painful for them. Right now, for example, I was just reading that India has this whole EV strategy, and this is another issue area, right? Like, EV and pharma, I think, are kind of similar to tech and finance in that they're critical. If somebody weaponizes, if China tomorrow decides to stop supplying APIs to India, I mean, what will happen? I don't know. Maybe India can source it from somewhere else. Maybe it cannot. But that's a question to ask. So things like that you shouldn't have so much dependency on, right? Same thing with the EV. India has a great EV policy to green and this and that, but I don't think anybody has really delved inside the supply chain of India's EV policy, or not that I've come across in terms of a paper. Where they say, okay, what are the EV dependencies that we are going to build into this plan, and what are some of the ways we can sort of ameliorate these dependencies? Are we going to, or is India going to dominate a certain sector within the EV business? Is it going to dominate the raw material sourcing? Is it going to dominate how are you going to sort of prevent the weaponization of dependency? And that's kind of how I would, as a non-superpower, look at the world of economics from an international relations perspective.
Yeah. So I think Vashishta stole some of my words when he spoke about developing, counter dependencies on India's part. That's what I used to call as developing asymmetric power within a industrial domain. So like master one particular area that the entire world needs, and then barter that for anything that we may require from the other nations. So that is a very, very critical part. And so I would just focus on the Indo-Pacific aspect that you spoke about, Abhi, and I'll answer that question and also answer a couple of points in a broader perspective. So when we talk about the potential invasion of Taiwan from a semiconductor perspective, or like we could even think about China being able to bring upon pressure or influence on Australia that would affect some of our raw material imports from that nation, things like that. I think we need to really one of the primary strategies that as a nation that we have followed is to diversify our sources of trade, right? And although diversification has helped a lot, it has also brought in a case where we are forced to hedge during critical geopolitical junctures. So at some point of time, we need to shift the window from being a stable equilibrium of multi-alignment, or how do I put it, like a diversification, to an unstable equilibrium where we are able to skew the global dynamics in such a way that people are forced to listen and attend to us. What do I mean by that? So it's not just that we focus on creating internal dependencies. We can also achieve sovereignty by focusing on showing the will and demonstrating to uh, play one superpower off against the other. So that also could create a space where we could kind of help bring about a de facto sovereignty, even though we may not have a substantial in terms of substance, we may not have sovereignty. The other aspect that we need to think about is IP protection. Uh, I think Ankit is a better person to talk about this, but uh, there are two schools of thought here, right? One is that IP by itself helps in developing more intellectual and innovation, helps in driving innovation across the world. And the other school of thought is that open sourcing the technology helps in driving innovation across the world. Now, from India's perspective, it's going to be an issue based position that we should be taking. So, in the short term, in which sectors do we want a higher IP protection from which we could take advantage of? In which sectors that we should be pushing for more open sourcing of base level technologies, so that we could take advantage and we could build on our strengths, knowing our weaknesses, and then push for a global IP technology. A global IP regime. These are all the things that we need to look at. We need not take a principled stand at all across that needs to be like non-hypocritical across the sectors. We have to be absolutely hypocritical. We have to be absolutely self-centered, and we'll have to measure as to where we want a higher IP protection that will help not strengthen our opponents, and where we want a lower IP protection where that will help us gain base level competencies from which we can build upon in future. The final point that I want to talk about is we need to bring the right stakeholders in. I mean, not just in terms of policy making, but as Vashishta mentioned, national champions, right? We need to bring the right kind of national champions. We need to provide them with not just finance. I think India is really good at accessing global capital currently, but we need to provide. There is a very how do I put it? When we talk about providing market access, we are still focused on providing India's domestic market access to Indian companies, right? Protecting our Indian retail against foreign multi-brand retail, protecting our data or cloud companies from what already the foreign cloud companies have achieved in terms of market penetration. But at some point of time, we need to start looking outward. We need to focus on, like in the initial stages when we are developing our market champions, apart from providing a protective market access of our market, we also need to work on gaining market access across the world for our companies in a much more mission manner. So let's say if we are at the lower end of a value chain, we need to focus on the low end markets initially, and then as we should also push our own companies to move up the value chain so that we are also able to tap into the high end market across the globe. Now, that is also going to provide an asymmetrical power and leverage for us that we can also use in future to kind of protect our sovereignty. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Vashisht and Krishnan. I think with most of the valuable perspectives and expertise having been meted out already, I am left with very little to offer. But I think I'd like to quickly conclude by saying, as as potentially controversial as this sounds, I think the best conclusion from this session could be India should have a dependency policy. Of course, not call it that for diplomatic and other reasons, but we should really look at how we are going to further our interests in terms of making more countries dependable on us, and for that, I think the it's a no-brainer. The number one thing that we have is human capital. We're definitely winning on that one. And there's no subjectivity on that front. I'm not a expert on natural resources or other things to be able to comment on whether we have enough silicon, we have enough fossil fuel supplies or whatever to basically focus more on and emerge in terms of increasing production, making the world dependable on us. But I feel somewhere we haven't quite been able to leverage our human capital advantage to the best of our abilities, because eventually, even if, see, you can't force people to be innovative, although I say this without prejudice to the fact that there is a fair amount of innovation that is happening in India. But nevertheless, we all understand how over the years, India has always been the natural outsourcing or executing partner for the Western countries, and that has contributed tremendously. In IT, the ITES is basically what has contributed tremendously to India's economic growth and globalized presence. And we moved from that to having enough encouragement and incentives and confidence to start innovating on our own. But I still feel making the Western world dependent on India in terms of outsourcing their human capital requirements or needs is something which is a no-brainer and should come naturally. And we should really focus on developing a policy around how we intend to do that, whether it is in terms of what Krishnan said, upskilling our workforce or upskilling our bureaucracy or whatever it may be. But that should be something that we should be focusing on, in my view. In conclusion of this very interesting session, but of course I cannot formally conclude it. It is for Abhivardhan as our moderator to do so. Back to you, Abhivardhan, for the concluding remarks.
Definitely. And with much interest, I think we really had an interesting discussion. And I think as there will be sector specific developments, we can discuss more about specific aspects, maybe in cybersec or knowledge economy or anything. So I think I must thank Ankitji, Vashisht, and Krishnan for this amazing discussion I could hold, and it has been a pleasure to host all of you. And I would request all the panelists to just stay for 2 minutes for a general feedback. And to viewers who watched it, as well as who have been watched it and heard, of course, thank you so much for attending AI Now. We will be coming up with interactive discussions on technology, artificial intelligence, Web3, and others shortly, as we do. Till then, Namova, and thank you so much.